Okay, so this is a model of the human brain, and I just want to go through and do a demo for you guys and identify the parts that are on your lab ID list and whatnot. So again, this is the human brain, and it would sit in the skull like so. This is anterior, this is posterior. And there's basically four major regions of the adult brain. The largest area is called the cerebrum. All of this area up here is the cerebrum. On the posterior side, we have these guys, that's the cerebellum. A third region is the brainstem, and all of this region is the brainstem there. And then the fourth region is the diencephalon, and the diencephalon is surrounded by the cerebrum here, and it sits on top of the brainstem. So if you take apart the brain like so, and this is the brainstem, then all this area up here would be the diencephalon. And then there's different parts of the diencephalon in there. But let's start with the brain intact like so, and start with the cerebrum. So again, this is all the cerebrum, and we can divide it into hemispheres. This is the right cerebral hemisphere, and this is the left cerebral hemisphere. And they're separated by this deep groove here called the longitudinal fissure. So right cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere, separated by the longitudinal fissure. And on the sheep brains, when you get to them, you'll be able to do this, but you can peel apart the hemispheres, and you will see that they are separate from each other. But the two hemispheres need to communicate. And so there's a band of tissue that runs across them called the corpus callosum. And that sends information back and forth and allows the cerebral hemispheres to communicate. And if you take this apart into the mid-sagittal section here, this band of tissue right there represents the corpus callosum, running back and forth and allowing the cerebral hemispheres to communicate. Now, something else you'll notice about the cerebrum here is that it's not flat. It has little valleys, and it has ridges, and it basically folds in on itself. And those features have different names. And so these individual little valleys right there are actually plural. They're called sulci. Singular is sulcus. So that's a sulcus right there. That's another sulcus. So these are all sulci, all these little valleys. And then the ridges here that separate the valleys are called gyri. Singular is gyrus. So this is a sulci, that's a sulci, and that's a gyrus that separates the two. And why is it that we would want these sulci and these gyri in the cerebrum? What is that doing for us? Well, what it does is it increases surface area, and as we'll find out, the cerebrum is where thinking takes place. And so the more surface area you have, the more thinking and processing you're going to be able to do. Okay, so we can divide the cerebrum up here into 5 different lobes. And I'm going to turn them like this and use this painted brain model to help us out a little bit here. So you have a lateral view. This is anterior, posterior, anterior, posterior. So they're both facing the same ways. And actually, I'm going to turn them back this way and start with this anterior view here. The first lobe of the brain that I want to mention is called the frontal lobe. And this whole front area here is the frontal lobe. And it's painted in orange here, but it also represents, it's also on the other side as well. All these lobes are bilateral. They're on both sides, on both cerebral hemispheres. So all of this is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is involved in a few different things. You have this prefrontal cortex in front, and that's involved in long-term planning and decision-making and all that kind of stuff. And then the frontal lobe is also involved in controlling skeletal muscle contraction. So skeletal muscle contraction, skeletal muscle commands are going to originate out of this frontal lobe. And in fact, there's this little band of tissue right there called the primary motor cortex that's going to be specifically where these skeletal muscle commands originate from. So this would be the primary motor cortex on this model here. Again, still within the frontal lobe. The next lobe that we have, and now I'll turn it this way so you have a lateral view, are the parietal lobes. So there's a parietal lobe, And there's one right there as well. And the parietal lobe is where sensory information coming from the skin is going to go to be processed. So touch, temperature, pain, all that information that comes from the skin goes up to the parietal lobe to be processed. And actually the first place that it goes is this little band of tissue there. That's called the primary sensory cortex. So this whole band of tissue is called the primary sensory cortex. It's part of the parietal lobe, and that's the first place that the sensory information goes to be processed. And actually when that sensory information hits that little area, that's when we become aware of the sensation. We're not aware of it until it hits that primary sensory cortex. And again, that's sensory information coming from the skin that's going to go to the parietal lobe. Back to our lateral view here. This lobe on the side, this close to the ear, this is the temporal lobe. So here's the temporal lobe. And this is where information about hearing, this is where auditory information is going to go to be processed. And it's also where olfactory or smell information is going to go to be processed here in the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. And then if we look at the back of the brain, this lobe in the back of the brain, again on both cerebral hemispheres, is called the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe. And that's where information about vision is going to go. So all the information from your eyes travels back here and ultimately goes to the occipital lobe, and that's where that visual information is processed. Trying to think if there's any other features that you guys need to know that I just talked about. There is this sulcus right here, and what's interesting about this sulcus is it divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and they call this the central sulcus. Okay. So this is the central sulcus dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and it's got the primary motor cortex right in front of it and the primary sensory cortex right in back of it. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about with regards to the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. So with regards to the cerebrum, the actual integration and processing and all that complex thought that we think about happens in the cerebral cortex, which is this outer region of the brain. And to find a nice representation of that, you can take part of this off here. And this is all cerebrum here, but you can see that there's this little outer band of pink tissue. And that represents gray matter, and specifically that's called the cerebral cortex. Cortex just means outer layer, so it's the outer layer of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. And that's where the nerve cell bodies are going to be located. That's where neurotransmitters are being released onto, and that's where actual integration occurs. Thinking occurs is in that cerebral cortex. And this is the white matter of the cerebrum, and that's just made up of axons. And so these are just axons taking sensory information to the cerebral cortex and axons taking motor information away from the cerebral cortex. And then there's one other lobe that I forgot. There's 5 lobes. And to get to this guy, so lateral view, you've actually got to peel the parietal lobe away from the temporal lobe. And if you do that, you'll see this guy right in there. And that is called the insula. And that's where sensory information about taste goes to be processed. So information from the tongue, taste information, goes to the insula to be processed. And you can see it's got the gyri and the sulci. Okay, I think the next place we can go to is the brainstem. And here's the start of the brainstem right there. And so the spinal cord comes up, passes through the foramen magnum, and it becomes the brainstem here. And there's a few different regions of it. This first region here, which is continuous with the spinal cord, is the medulla oblongata. So that's the medulla oblongata. And then you've got these two bulgy regions that are on top of it, and that's called the pons. So the medulla oblongata, the pons, and then the third region, which is kind of hard to get to. I'm going to take the cerebellum off. But essentially it's this region up above there. That's called the midbrain. And that's the third region of the brainstem. So the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain up there. And we can peel these apart. So now you have a mid-sagittal view, and this is a mid-sagittal cut and a sagittal view. This is the medulla, this is the pons, and that's the midbrain back there. So this is all brainstem. Okay. Then on top of the brainstem is a region called the diencephalon. So all this region here is called the diencephalon. And there's a few different parts to the diencephalon. One is the pineal gland, which is going to be in back here. We'll see it on the sheep brain. It's actually not represented that well here. So there's that region. There's the hypothalamus, which is generally this region right there. And then the major region is called the thalamus. And the thalamus is on both sides of the cerebral hemisphere, and it's actually separated by that little distinction there. Let me see if I can get up in here. This is going to be tough here, but and again, the sheep brain is actually really good for this. But that's a thalamus there, and then there's a thalamus on the other side, and it's separated by what we call the third ventricle. So this space right there is called the third ventricle. It's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and on either side, on each cerebral hemisphere, there's a thalamus, and that represents a thalamus right there. Okay, so this little pink band of tissue here, that represents a tuft of capillaries, and that's called the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is going to be responsible for producing cerebral spinal fluid. And that cerebral spinal fluid is going to fill the ventricles. So this is the third ventricle, and it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid that is produced from this choroid plexus right there. Okay. I already mentioned the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum there, and that's involved in coordinating kind of all the complex movements that we perform via skeletal muscles is all smoothed out and coordinated in the cerebellum. If you have damage there, then you'll have really jerky movements, and you won't have that smooth movement that skeletal movement that you're used to. Let's see. So this right here, this is a inferior view. This is anterior, this is posterior. And the nose would basically be right there. Okay. And so this represents the top of the nasal cavity. And within there, you're going to find these little end regions there. Those are called the olfactory bulbs. Okay, and that's where smell information is going to first go. And then it travels back to the brain via these olfactory tracts. So we have olfactory bulbs and then olfactory tracts, and that's going to go eventually to the temporal lobe to be processed. Okay. Anterior, again, and inferior view, olfactory bulbs, olfactory tracts. Then also you're going to have an eye right there, and you're going to have an eye right there. And out of the back of the eyes come the optic nerves. And these aren't the best with regards to this, but this represents an optic nerve. and that represents an optic nerve right there. And what happens, see if I can get this to stay. So there's an optic nerve, there's one, and those optic nerves cross. And the location that they cross at is called the optic chiasma. So they cross at the optic chiasma, and then they become the optic tracts, which you can peel away and you can see back there. And those optic tracts are eventually going to take that information to actually to the thalamus and then back to the occipital lobe. And then just a couple other things. The cranial nerves. Lots of the cranial nerves originate from the brainstem region here. In fact, most of them. And so you'll see all these little Roman numerals like 12, 7, and whatnot. And all of these represent cranial nerves that are entering the brainstem region. A lot of those enter the medulla. Some of them enter the pons right there. And you don't have to know those individually on this brain model, but you do have to be able to recognize that each of these are cranial nerves that are coming into and out of the brainstem region. And then lastly, at the bottom of your bins, you guys will see this little P-shaped guy right there. And what that is that's the pituitary gland, which usually sits at the base of the hypothalamus right in there, but it's just come off. And so now it's just a little pituitary gland rattling around in your guys' bins. And I do not have that on the lab ID list. And I'm trying to think, but I think that's it. Okay, so that'll be good to get you guys going.